The gates were open, the guards were gone, and nothing stood between these men and the road outside the camp. Yet not a single step was taken, because the real question was no longer whether they were allowed to leave, but whether a mind shaped by waiting, obedience, and repetition could still recognize freedom when it finally arrived. The first thing the men noticed was not a change in rules or an announcement or even a visible decision made by those in charge, but rather the absence of interruption, because time inside the camp had begun to stretch without resistance, moving forward without signals, warnings, or commands that once gave shape to every hour of the day. Mornings arrived without urgency, unfolding through routines that no longer felt enforced, yet still repeated themselves with quiet accuracy, as if the body continued to follow instructions that were no longer being issued, relying on habit instead of direction to decide when to wake, when to stand, and when to move. The guards remained present, though their movements carried less intention than before, walking familiar paths without urgency, without raised voices, and without the visible authority that once defined the boundary between permission and consequence, creating a strange imbalance in which control had not been removed, but had simply become less visible. No orders were announced, and no warnings followed, leaving the men surrounded by a kind of stillness that did not feel peaceful, because silence inside a place built for discipline carried weight, suggesting that something had changed without clearly stating what that change meant or how it was supposed to be understood. Conversations between the prisoners slowed, not because words were forbidden, but because language itself seemed uncertain of its purpose, since questions no longer had clear recipients, and statements no longer produced reactions strong enough to confirm whether they mattered. The camp itself appeared unchanged, with the same fences, the same watchtowers, and the same open space separating the barracks from the perimeter, yet the familiarity of these structures began to feel deceptive, as if they were waiting to be interpreted differently, depending on whether the men chose to see them as barriers or merely as objects left behind by a system that no longer insisted on being obeyed. At certain moments, a man would pause during routine movement, slowing his pace slightly as his attention drifted toward the outer edge of the camp, where the path beyond remained visible, unblocked, and ordinary, offering no dramatic signal that crossing it would trigger consequence or response. No alarms sounded, no guards reacted, and no corrective force emerged to clarify the meaning of that pause, leaving the moment suspended just long enough for uncertainty to grow heavier than fear, because fear at least had rules, while uncertainty demanded interpretation. The absence of immediate response began to reshape behavior in subtle ways, not pushing the men forward, but instead encouraging caution, as if the lack of restriction itself required careful handling, since freedom without instruction felt unfamiliar, untested, and potentially misleading. Each day continued in this manner, passing without escalation, without relief, and without resolution, creating a psychological environment in which movement no longer depended on force, but on internal permission that few seemed prepared to grant themselves. What made this state especially unsettling was not the presence of confinement, but the quiet realization that nothing external appeared to be preventing action anymore, leaving the men alone with the responsibility of deciding whether action should occur at all. The longer this condition persisted, the more difficult it became to identify the moment when choice had first appeared, because it had arrived without ceremony, slipping into the daily rhythm unnoticed, until the possibility of movement existed alongside the growing habit of remaining still. By the time anyone considered what could be done, the question had already shifted, no longer asking whether the path was open, but whether stepping onto it still felt possible in a place where waiting had slowly replaced intention, and routine had begun to feel safer than decision. As the days continued without clear instruction or visible enforcement, The men began to notice that the most powerful influence shaping their behavior was no longer authority, but familiarity, because the absence of interference slowly transformed into a condition they adjusted to rather than questioned, allowing waiting itself to become the dominant response to every undefined situation. Time inside the camp no longer felt segmented by orders or events, but instead flowed as a continuous stretch of repetition, where mornings resembled afternoons, and afternoons blended into evenings without meaningful distinction, reinforcing the sense that nothing required immediate action and that remaining still carried no cost. The lack of urgency did not produce relief, but rather a subtle erosion of intention, as decisions that once felt automatic now required conscious effort, and effort itself began to feel unnecessary in an environment where inaction seemed to preserve stability without demanding consequence. Movement became cautious not because it was restricted, but because it felt exposed, drawing attention to itself in a space where attention had previously been directed outward toward guards, rules, and visible boundaries, rather than inward toward personal judgment and responsibility. Even simple choices, such as altering routine paths or lingering slightly longer in open areas, carried a quiet tension, not driven by fear of punishment, but by uncertainty over whether deviation still held meaning in a system that appeared indifferent to compliance or resistance alike. The men spoke less about possibilities and more about schedules, habits, and trivial observations, unconsciously narrowing the scope of conversation to subjects that required no decision-making, as though language itself was being reshaped to avoid confronting the presence of choice. What had once been recognized as confinement began to feel increasingly abstract, since no immediate force reminded them of its purpose, allowing the physical structures of the camp to fade into the background while psychological boundaries took their place, invisible yet increasingly influential. Waiting, which initially served as a temporary response to uncertainty, gradually solidified into a default state, providing a sense of order without resolution and offering predictability in an environment where clarity had quietly disappeared. The longer this condition persisted, the less anyone remembered what had first prompted the pause, because the original reason no longer mattered once waiting proved capable of sustaining itself, reinforcing the idea that stillness did not require justification. At moments, the thought of movement surfaced briefly, not as a plan, but as an abstract consideration, quickly dismissed not through fear, but through the quiet reassurance that there was no requirement to act, no signal demanding decision, and no urgency pushing against delay. This internal adjustment did not occur dramatically or uniformly, but through countless small accommodations, each one reducing the need to question the present situation until remaining where they were felt not imposed, but chosen, even if that choice was never consciously acknowledged. By adapting to the absence of pressure, the men unknowingly absorbed a new form of control, one that relied not on force or restriction, but on comfort with the familiar, making the idea of departure feel less necessary with each passing day. As this pattern settled into place, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between patience and resignation, since both looked identical in behavior, differing only in motivation, which had grown harder to identify the longer waiting continued without interruption. What lingered beneath this adjustment was not relief, but a quiet unease, rooted in the realization that the longer nothing happened, the more effort it would take for anything to happen at all, leaving the men suspended in a state where time moved forward, but intention remained fixed. As the sense of waiting settled deeper into daily life, the idea of freedom began to lose its simplicity, no longer appearing as a clear direction or an obvious improvement, but instead emerging as a weight that required effort clarity, and personal responsibility in a place where effort had gradually been trained out of necessity. The men did not speak about leaving in practical terms, not because the thought was forbidden, but because imagining movement now demanded an unfamiliar kind of internal coordination, one that required intention to be rebuilt rather than merely activated, making the idea of departure feel distant even when nothing visibly opposed it. What once might have been recognized as opportunity slowly transformed into a source of quiet discomfort, since opportunity implied decision, and decision implied ownership of outcome, something that had been absent long enough to feel unnatural within the controlled rhythm they had learned to trust. Routine, which had initially served as a temporary structure, now offered a form of relief by removing the burden of choice, allowing days to pass without the mental strain of evaluating alternatives or confronting uncertainty beyond the familiar boundaries of the camp. The absence of clear authority no longer felt like relief, but like exposure, because without instructions to follow or rules to test against, the responsibility for action rested entirely within the individual, where doubt, hesitation, and internal conflict carried no external resolution. Some men noticed a subtle resistance forming whenever the thought of stepping beyond the known paths arose, not as fear of punishment, but as a tension created by the need to redefine themselves outside a system that had quietly shaped their behavior for an extended period. Freedom, once imagined as a release, now required reconstruction of identity, forcing questions about direction, purpose, and consequence that had remained dormant while daily life demanded nothing more than compliance and endurance. In this state, remaining inside the familiar structure began to feel safer than confronting the undefined space beyond it, not because that space was threatening, but because it lacked the predictable framework that had come to regulate thought, movement, and expectation. The longer this internal negotiation remained unresolved, the more effort the idea of leaving seemed to require, until effort itself became a deterrent, reinforcing stillness through mental exhaustion rather than physical restraint. No single moment marked this shift, and no visible change signaled that something essential had been lost. Yet the accumulation of small internal adjustments gradually reshaped perception, making freedom feel less like an invitation and more like an obligation that demanded readiness few felt prepared to achieve. What persisted beneath this quiet transformation was a growing awareness that the barrier was no longer located in fences, schedules, or authority, but within the hesitation that formed whenever choice appeared without guidance, leaving the men suspended between possibility and inertia. As days continued to pass without interruption, freedom remained present yet unused, not because it was denied, but because engaging with it now required a psychological step that felt heavier than remaining where they were, allowing stillness to maintain its hold without resistance. As time continued without interruption, the men gradually stopped experiencing their situation as temporary, not because anyone declared it permanent, but because the mind began to organize reality around what persisted rather than what was possible, allowing continuity itself to redefine meaning. The camp no longer felt like a place they were enduring while awaiting change, but like an environment that simply existed, complete in its predictability, where each day followed the last without contradiction, reinforcing the sense that nothing required reevaluation or disruption. What had once been perceived as waiting subtly transformed into routine acceptance, as the absence of escalation convinced the mind that stability, even without clarity, was preferable to uncertainty, which demanded effort without guaranteeing improvement. The idea of leaving no longer carried urgency or emotional charge, fading into the background as one of many abstract considerations that did not demand resolution. Much like unanswered questions that lose relevance through repetition rather than through explanation. Behavior adjusted accordingly, not through conscious agreement, but through alignment with the path of least resistance, as remaining where they were required no justification, while movement increasingly felt like a deviation that needed internal approval few were motivated to seek. The physical boundaries of the camp remained visible, yet their significance diminished, becoming part of the landscape rather than symbols of confinement, as perception shifted away from what those boundaries represented toward how familiar they had become. In this state, stillness began to feel correct, not because it was imposed, but because it matched the internal rhythm that had developed through repetition, making any alternative feel disruptive rather than liberating. The men did not articulate this change, nor did they recognize it as a loss, because it occurred gradually, embedded within countless ordinary moments that carried no emotional markers strong enough to trigger concern or resistance. Freedom, once associated with motion and release, now appeared distant and impractical, not due to fear, but because it no longer fit into the mental framework that had formed around predictability, routine, and minimal effort. Remaining inside the known environment offered coherence, while the unknown beyond it lacked structure, clarity, and reassurance, making the familiar feel not only safer, but more reasonable. Over time, the absence of decision became indistinguishable from decision itself, as days passed without challenge, allowing the mind to conclude that nothing essential was missing and that the current state required neither explanation nor change. By accepting what remained constant, the men unknowingly allowed possibility to fade without confrontation, not through force or persuasion, but through the quiet normalization of stillness as the most sensible response to a world that no longer demanded anything else. By the time the men reached this stage, there was no longer a sense that something was being delayed, because delay itself had lost meaning, dissolving into a continuous present where days passed without distinction and possibility no longer carried urgency. The absence of action no longer felt temporary or unresolved, but settled into a condition that required no explanation, as the mind adjusted to the idea that remaining still was not a failure to decide, but simply the most coherent response to an environment that asked nothing and demanded nothing in return. Thoughts of movement still appeared from time to time, not as plans or intentions, but as distant notions that surfaced briefly before fading, unable to anchor themselves to motivation strong enough to overcome the comfort of familiarity. The idea of leaving no longer triggered internal debate, because debate requires opposing forces, and those forces had gradually disappeared, leaving only the quiet continuity of routine as the default state. In this condition, effort itself became unnecessary, since effort implies purpose, and purpose had been slowly eroded by repetition, predictability, and the absence of consequence attached to an action. The men did not experience this as resignation, nor did they perceive it as loss, because nothing had been taken from them in a visible or dramatic way, allowing the transition to feel natural rather than imposed. What made this transformation complete was the lack of emotional signal, since fear, hope, and anticipation had all diminished equally, leaving behind a neutral state where remaining felt neither good nor bad, but simply appropriate. Without clear emotional markers, the mind no longer searched for alternatives, accepting the present as sufficient and interpreting the absence of pressure as confirmation that nothing needed to change. The possibility of departure existed, yet it no longer functioned as an option, because options require evaluation, and evaluation had quietly ceased once stillness proved capable of sustaining daily life without disruption. In this state, not choosing no longer felt passive, but definitive, as though the decision had already been made through repetition rather than intention, reinforcing the idea that stability, did not require justification. The men continued their routines, not because they were instructed to do so, but because routine had become the most efficient way to move through time without confronting uncertainty, allowing days to pass without resistance or reflection. By the time this pattern fully settled, the question of whether they could leave had lost relevance, replaced by a deeper, unspoken conclusion that leaving no longer belonged to the structure of their reality, even though nothing external prevented it. What remained was not confinement, but completion, as the absence of choice finalized itself into a condition that no longer felt open, unresolved, or temporary, but quietly finished. Nothing dramatic marked the end of this period, because endings do not always arrive with visible change, and what had already settled into the mind no longer required confirmation through action or explanation. The camp remained as it was, the path beyond stayed open, and time continued forward without interruption, while the absence of movement quietly affirmed itself as the final outcome, not through force, but through familiarity. What mattered was not whether anyone could have stepped outside, but how easily the mind had learned to accept stillness once it no longer felt imposed, allowing possibility to exist without ever being used. By the time freedom stood fully available, it no longer felt urgent, because urgency depends on contrast, and contrast had slowly disappeared through repetition and waiting. What remained was a question with no clear answer, lingering beyond the place itself, asking not why no one left, but how often opportunity fades simply because nothing inside insists that it must be taken. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.